He sneered at me like I was nothing. "He's only a waiter," my son-in-law told everyone, waving his glass toward me as though I were some servant who didn't belong among them. Guests chuckled politely, and I kept pouring champagne. Then a voice rang out across the room. "Wait, that man's on TV." The room froze. My son-in-law's hand shook, his glass slipped, and crystal shattered across the floor. In that moment, everything changed. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if your son-in-law tried to humiliate you in front of your daughter's wedding guests? The ballroom shimmered with light. Crystal chandeliers dangled above polished marble floors, casting reflections across the gold-rimmed glasses lined perfectly on every table. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner, their soft notes barely rising above the hum of conversation, as guests in tailored suits and gowns laughed easily with one another. This was not my world, though my daughter Emma stood at the center of it, radiant in white lace, her cheeks glowing with happiness. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel pride. Years of double shifts, years of saving every tip I earned had gone into her education and her dreams. Now she stood surrounded by wealth, marrying into a family that looked down on me, yet could not see the sacrifices behind the man who raised her. My hands were steady on the tray of champagne glasses I carried, the uniform of a waiter making me invisible among the people who mattered to my new son-in-law. It happened as the music faded and the chatter settled. Ethan, my daughter's groom, stood at the head table, the spotlight catching the gleam of his cufflinks. He tapped his glass with a silver spoon, commanding attention the way men who lived in boardrooms did without effort. The crowd hushed, ready to listen. He began with words that were smooth, polished, full of thanks for friends, colleagues, and family. I poured champagne for a woman in emerald silk, keeping my eyes low. But I felt his gaze find me. When he spoke again, his voice took on a sharper tone. "You see," he said, gesturing casually in my direction. "Not everyone here moves in the same circles. That man serving you champagne? That is Emma's father. He's only a waiter." A ripple went through the room. Some guests laughed politely, thinking it part of a light-hearted jest, while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. My face grew hot, but I kept my posture steady, as if the words had not sliced into me. The tray grew heavier in my hands, though I refused to let it shake. I had been insulted many times in my life by customers who saw through me as if I were furniture. But never had I expected such humiliation from the man marrying my daughter. Ethan smirked, pleased with his performance, certain that I would bow my head and remain silent. He raised his glass high, reveling in the dominance of the moment. Emma's smile faltered, her eyes darting toward me with worry. But she said nothing, bound by the weight of her new reality. I swallowed hard, forcing my jaw to unclench. Anger surged, but I buried it beneath years of practice, years of biting back responses to men who thought money gave them the right to belittle others. I moved to another table, pouring champagne with the same care I always had, refusing to let Ethan see that his words had cut me. Yet inside, I was trembling. The pride I had felt only moments before had been trampled beneath the polished shoes of a man who believed status defined worth. The air was heavy with his arrogance. He went on with his toast, speaking of ambition, of circles of power, of the greatness he expected to build with Emma by his side. The applause that followed was half-hearted, tinged with unease, yet he seemed oblivious. He lifted his glass once more, smirking as though he had secured victory not only in marriage, but in the battle for dominance over me. My eyes lowered, but my ears caught every word. He thought I was small, a shadow, nothing more than a servant on the edges of his perfect evening. Then it happened. At a table near the bar, a young man glanced up at the television screen mounted high on the wall. The venue kept it running quietly, flickering with a muted broadcast to entertain those who lingered near the drinks. The young man froze, his eyes wide, then leaned forward as though he had seen a ghost. His voice rose above the chatter, sharp and full of sudden recognition. "Wait, that's him. That's the same man. He's on TV." The room turned. Dozens of heads swiveled toward the screen, then back to me, then to the screen again. My tray hung motionless in my grip, the crystal glasses catching the glow of the chandeliers as silence pressed down over the celebration. On the screen, a younger version of myself filled the frame, wearing a naval officer's uniform in a film I had once given everything to. The lines I spoke decades ago rolled silently across my lips. But the expression, the stance, the presence was unmistakable. The room drew in a collective breath as the truth unfurled before them. Ethan's smirk collapsed. His hand, which had been holding his champagne glass high in triumph, trembled suddenly. He glanced at the screen, then at me, then back again, his face draining of color. The arrogance that had wrapped him like armor cracked in an instant. The glass slipped from his grasp, striking the edge of the table before falling to the floor where it shattered in a spray of crystal and fizzing champagne. Guests gasped as the sound echoed across the ballroom, but all eyes remained on me, the man he had dismissed as nothing. That moment changed everything. Long before the champagne shattered on the ballroom floor, before Ethan's cruel words made me invisible in front of Emma's friends and his powerful associates, there was the watch. It had been in my possession for years, resting inside a small wooden box that carried with it not just time, but memory. My father had worn that gold pocket watch every day of his life, keeping it tucked safely in his vest, polishing it every evening with the same careful hands that once held mine. When he passed, he left it to me, and I had always known I would one day pass it down to my daughter. Emma had been the light of my life since the day she was born, and though she never knew her grandfather, I wanted her to feel a piece of him close on her wedding day. I arrived at Ethan's house 2 nights before the ceremony with the box under my arm. The drive there had been quiet, the hum of my old car barely covering the nervous rhythm of my heart. Ethan's neighborhood was the kind where gates opened only after cameras scanned your license plate. Manicured lawns lined the road, each house sitting proudly behind walls of glass and stone, as though competing for attention. When the doors of his home opened, the smell of expensive candles and polished wood rushed out to meet me. Emma came down the hallway, her steps light but hurried. Her eyes lit up when she saw me, and for a moment, I forgot all the worry that had weighed me down. She hugged me tightly, her perfume carrying notes of roses, the same scent her mother once wore. "Dad, you made it," she said, with that smile that always made me feel young again. She looked at the box in my hands. "What's this?" "Your grandfather's watch," I told her, my voice steadier than I felt. "I thought you should have it for the wedding." Her expression softened, a shimmer in her eyes betraying the swell of emotion she tried to contain. She touched the lid of the box reverently. "Can I see it?" Before I could open it, Ethan appeared from the living room, a glass of red wine in his hand. He looked at me the way one might look at a stain on a white carpet. His eyes flickered to the khakis I had pressed that morning, my best clothes, though I knew they fell short of his standard. He extended his hand briefly. "David," he said, cool and formal. His handshake was short, more of an obligation than a greeting. "Still at that little Italian place, aren't you?" "La Riviera," I replied evenly. "Marco has kept me on for a long time. It's steady work." Right, he said, already turning his attention to the box I held. And what's in there? Emma's voice jumped in, eager and bright. It's Grandpa's watch. I opened the box carefully, revealing the gold pocket watch inside. The soft light of the room caught on its polished surface, and for me, time stopped. I remembered the way my father used to snap it open with a flourish, checking the hour before tucking it safely away. Emma's breath caught. It's beautiful, she whispered. Ethan barely looked at it. He swirled the wine in his glass and said flatly, Vintage. Probably worth something to a collector. The dismissal stung sharper than any insult. This watch wasn't about money. It wasn't a trinket to be appraised and traded. It was family, history, sacrifice embodied in one object. Emma understood that immediately. Ethan did not. His gaze had already shifted back to the room, his interest lost. I closed the box slowly, the weight of it heavier in my hands now. Aunt Linda's voice called from the dining room, announcing that dinner was ready. Emma looped her arm through mine, guiding me toward the table. It was laid out with crystal glasses that caught the glow of an ornate chandelier, each plate set with military precision. I sat where Emma indicated, trying to find comfort in her presence, though the wealth surrounding me pressed in like a wall. We made conversation at first. I asked about the plans, the flowers, the guest list. Emma spoke warmly, though Ethan often cut her off, answering with efficiency. We're keeping it intimate, he explained, slicing his steak with surgical precision. Close friends, colleagues, partners from the firm, influential people. Family, of course, Emma added gently. Of course, Ethan echoed, his tone dripping with something that made me look up. His eyes lingered on me, as though testing how much space I would take in his carefully curated world. The talk shifted to catering choices, venues, arrangements, and I tried to join in with polite comments. Yet every word I offered seemed to fall flat, either ignored or answered with a clipped remark. The longer it went on, the clearer it became. Ethan didn't want me there. Finally, he set his fork down with quiet finality and leaned back in his chair. David, he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone used to running meetings. I think we should discuss something. Emma froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. Ethan, she began, but he raised his hand slightly to silence her. It's about the wedding, he continued smoothly. You see, my guests are not ordinary. These are people who shape industries, men and women who fund ventures, who sit on boards, who write policy. This wedding isn't just about vows. It's a gathering of influence. He let that word hang heavy in the air. My chest tightened. What about it? He leaned forward, his expression cool and measured. I need to be direct. You're a waiter. My guests, they move in different circles. Your presence could be awkward. The word struck like a physical blow. I felt my face flush, my fingers tighten around the napkin in my lap. Around the table, silence fell. Emma's voice broke it, sharp with anger. That's my father. I respect that, Ethan replied smoothly. But this wedding is an investment in our future. I will not risk my reputation because of misplaced sentimentality. I found my voice, though it wavered. I raised Emma. I worked double shifts to put her through school, to give her every opportunity. That's not sentiment. That's reality. He cut me off, his words sharp as knives. Admirable, yes. But this is now. You serve food for a living. My guests build companies. Do you really think you belong in that conversation? The room spun slightly, my ears buzzing with the rush of blood. Emma protested, her voice rising. but it was distant to me, muffled by the pounding in my head. Aunt Linda cleared her throat, shifting uncomfortably, but Ethan stood, his decision made. Perhaps we should continue this privately. David, step with me onto the terrace. The glass door slid shut behind us, cutting off Emma's voice. Outside, the night air was cool, carrying the faint scent of jasmine from the manicured garden below. Workers bustled in the distance, setting up white chairs and stringing lights between trees. The stage for my daughter's wedding was unfolding before my eyes, yet I stood there as an outsider. Ethan positioned himself against the railing, framed by the glittering city lights. He looked every inch the portrait of success, and he knew it. I stood awkwardly near the door, still clutching the box with the watch. "Beautiful view," he said casually, gesturing toward the city beyond. "This house cost me $2.3 million. The wedding itself? $200,000. He smiled, a sharp edge to it. Flowers alone are 15 grand. The photographer, another 8. Her dress, 12. Every detail matters when powerful eyes are watching. The numbers slapped me harder than his words. I thought of every dollar I had saved, every tip folded carefully into Emma's tuition payments. I thought of 4 years at UCLA, the car I bought her, the apartment deposit. All of it earned one table at a time, one aching shift after another. "I paid for her education," I said quietly. "I worked myself to the bone so she could have this chance." "That was then," Ethan snapped. "This is now. She's my responsibility. And I'm telling you, your presence will be an embarrassment." The watchbox felt like lead in my hands. It was supposed to be a blessing, a connection to family, a gift of love. Instead, it had become a symbol of rejection. "You cannot just decide this," I began, but he cut me off with a whisper that dripped with power. "I can, and I will. Do you understand what this day means? The mayor will be here, CEOS senators, and you want to sit there in your pressed khakis like you belong? No, David, not here, not ever." Through the glass, I saw Emma pacing, her face twisted with worry. She kept glancing toward us, but she did not step outside. She was caught between us, powerless. "She's my daughter," I said firmly. "She's my fiancée," Ethan replied, final and cold. "And I won't let you turn her wedding into a charity case." The workers below had finished with the chairs. Row after row of white seats faced an altar where Emma would stand without me. I looked down at the box in my hands, all the fight drained from me in that instant, leaving behind a hollow weight. "Fine," I said quietly. "I won't come." The words clung to me as I stepped back into the house, past Emma's searching eyes, past Aunt Linda's tight-lipped frown. I did not stop to explain, and I did not hand over the box with the watch. I left Ethan on his terrace with his wine and his smug expression, a man certain he had secured victory over someone he believed beneath him. By the time I reached the front door, my body felt heavy, every step dragging as though I carried stones instead of memories. The night air outside was cooler, but it did little to ease the fire burning inside my chest. I drove in silence, the road unfolding in 3 chapters of my life. The first was Ethan's neighborhood, lined with palatial homes and gates that shimmered with coated lights. Lawns sculpted into perfect emerald squares stretched endlessly, while the houses themselves looked more like monuments than places to live. Each window glowed warm against the night, yet the warmth felt hollow. It was a world I had never been invited into, a world where I was tolerated only when carrying a tray. As I left that district behind, the scenery shifted. The second chapter belonged to the middle-class neighborhoods, the ones I had passed through countless times when Emma was young. Rows of modest houses stood side by side, porches decorated with bicycles, basketball hoops, and wind chimes. I remembered walking with Emma down these streets when she was little, pointing out holiday lights in December, teaching her how to ride her bike until she found her balance. These were the streets where I had dreamed of giving her more, always telling myself that hard work would pay off. The third chapter was my own. Apartment buildings rose close together, their bricks weathered, their stairwells lit by tired bulbs. Metal mailboxes bore the scratches of decades, and the paint on the doors peeled like skin. My car rattled as I pulled into the lot, surrounded by vehicles that had outlived their prime. Here, people didn't talk about influence or networking opportunities. They talked about overdue rent, about balancing bills, about how to stretch a paycheck until the next one arrived. It was the world I had built Emma's future from, one table at a time, one tip at a time. Inside my small apartment, the silence pressed down heavier than Ethan's arrogance. No chandeliers, no marble foyer, just a narrow hallway leading to a single room filled with memories. Photographs lined the walls. Emma at her first birthday, Emma in her cap and gown, Emma laughing at Christmas mornings where the presents had been few but the joy abundant. I set the watch box on the kitchen table and sat down heavily, staring at it as if it might answer the questions swirling inside me. I pulled open the drawer where I kept old bills, some stamped paid, others reminders of struggles I had just barely overcome. I dug out the calculator, its buttons worn, from years of use, and began adding the numbers that told the story of my sacrifices. 4 years of tuition at UCLA, each year more than $40,000. Room and board, another $18,000 annually. The down payment on her car, $3,000 from my savings. The deposit on her apartment, $2,000 more. The numbers piled up, blurring together. But I pushed through them. Over $200,000, all earned carrying trays and smiling through long shifts, all saved while I wore out shoes and knees to make sure Emma never felt the hunger or limitation I had known. The tears threatened, but I swallowed them down. My sacrifices had not been about money. They had been about love, about giving my daughter a life beyond my reach. Now that life had brought her to a man who thought so little of me that he could bar me from her wedding. I thought of Ethan's words on the terrace, cold and final. "You're a waiter. You don't belong." He had meant to crush me, to erase me from the most important day of Emma's life. The phone buzzed suddenly on the table, startling me from my spiral of thought. Emma's name appeared on the screen, and my heart clenched. I answered quickly, steadying my voice. "Sweetheart?" "Dad." Her voice was thick with tears. "I'm so sorry about tonight." "It's all right," I told her softly, though it wasn't. "Don't let it weigh on you." "It's not all right," she said firmly, her voice trembling with emotion. "He had no right to speak to you that way. You're my father. You should be at my wedding." I closed my eyes, listening to her words. Sometimes life isn't fair, Emma. What matters is that you're happy. That's all I've ever wanted. "But how?" she whispered. "How can I be happy knowing he's keeping you away? He won't change his mind, Dad. He was serious. He's stubborn." Her voice cracked, and I could picture her pacing the length of her bedroom, tears streaming down her face, her perfect day marred by the clash between the two men in her life. My throat tightened, but I forced calm into my tone. "Don't worry about me. Focus on yourself. Focus on your vows, on your future. That's where your heart should be." We stayed on the line for a few moments longer, her breathing uneven, my words failing to soothe her pain. Finally, she whispered, "I love you, Dad." "I love you too, sweetheart." I ended the call and set the phone down with a sigh. The silence that followed was heavier than before, as though the walls themselves carried the weight of Ethan's judgment. I walked to the closet and opened it slowly. Hanging there was my work uniform: black trousers, a white shirt, and a black vest. The fabric was simple, worn from years of use, but as I looked at it now, it seemed to shimmer with a new kind of possibility. It had always been the symbol of my invisibility, the outfit that allowed me to move silently through other people's important nights, unseen and unacknowledged. Yet tonight, staring at it under the dim light of my apartment, it no longer felt like a burden. It felt like armor. I touched the vest, remembering the thousands of nights I had slipped between tables, carrying drinks, overhearing conversations, invisible to the powerful, who never once considered the man behind the uniform. Ethan had been right about one thing. I was only a waiter. But he had forgotten the strength that came with being unseen. He had forgotten that the invisible could walk into places others tried to keep them out of. An idea began to take shape, fragile at first, then sharper, clearer. My pulse quickened as the plan unfolded in my mind. If Ethan wanted me invisible, then invisible I would be. Sleep never came that night. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the faint hum of the city filtering through my thin apartment walls, my thoughts circling endlessly. Ethan's sneer haunted me, his voice replaying over and over, telling me I didn't belong, telling me my life's work made me unworthy of my daughter's happiness. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma's face, her voice thick with tears on the phone, begging me to be there. By the time dawn pushed pale light through the blinds, I had already made my decision. I would not be absent from her wedding. If Ethan wanted me unseen, then I would use the only disguise I had worn my entire adult life, the uniform of a waiter. By mid-morning, I was driving across town to La Riviera, the restaurant where I had worked for 15 years. The streets were still wet from an early drizzle, the sidewalks slick with reflection. Familiarity settled into my chest as I parked behind the building, the sight of the brick exterior and weathered back door comforting in a way Ethan's house never could be. This place had been my refuge, my stage, my livelihood. It had paid Emma's tuition, filled her birthdays with gifts, kept food on our table. Every corner of La Riviera carried a memory, every scuff on the kitchen tiles a story. Inside, the air was rich with the scent of garlic, onions, and simmering stock. The prep stations were already alive with activity, knives moving with practiced rhythm, pots clanging softly as cooks began their routines. Marco stood at the counter, his thick hands working with onions, slicing with the precision of someone who had done the job 10,000 times. His dark hair had thinned since we first met, and his back carried more weight than it once did. But his presence filled the room with the quiet authority of a man who had built something with his own hands. "You're early," he said without looking up, his voice steady but warm. "Saturday shifts don't start until 10. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, moving toward the coffee pot on the side counter. I poured 2 mugs, adding sugar to his as I always had, our small ritual over the years. I set it beside him, and he finally paused his cutting to meet my eyes. "What troubles you, my friend?" he asked, his gaze sharp, already sensing something heavier than the usual exhaustion. I leaned against the counter, the weight of what I was about to say pressing hard on my chest. "Tomorrow is Emma's wedding." "Ah, yes," Marco said with a small smile. "At the big house, with the expensive garden. Very grand, I hear." He sipped his coffee. "You must be proud." "I am," I said, my voice catching. "But there's a problem." His brow furrowed. What kind of problem? I took a deep breath. Ethan doesn't want me there. He told me to stay away, said I would embarrass him in front of his guests. The knife stilled in Marco's hand. His expression hardened, his jaw tightening. He said this to you? Last night, on his terrace. He told me I didn't belong. Marco's hands clenched into fists, the lines of his face sharpening with anger. What kind of man says this to the father of his bride? He is a fool. He cares more about appearances than family, I said quietly. That's the truth of it. Marco shook his head in disgust. So, what will you do? Sit at home while your daughter marries this man? I can't, I said firmly. That's why I need your help. He tilted his head, studying me carefully. What can I do? I want you to get me onto the staff for the wedding, I said, the words tumbling out with more force than I intended. Just for tomorrow, one day. Let me work as a server. Ethan can't forbid me if I'm invisible among the catering staff. He won't even see me, but I'll be there. I'll see her walk down the aisle. I'll see her take her vows. Marco stared at me as though I had suggested robbing a bank. You want to work at your own daughter's wedding? Yes. David, he said, lowering his voice as though speaking to a man possessed. That is madness. A father should sit in the front row, not carry trays like a servant. Sometimes we don't get what should be, I replied softly. Sometimes we take what we can. He turned back to his onions, cutting them with renewed force, each slice sharper than the last. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the rhythm of the knife. Finally, he set it down, his eyes still hard. Do you really want to do this? I've never wanted anything more, I said, my voice steady now. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past, the sound of its brakes echoing against the alley walls. The morning carried on as usual, the world indifferent to the storm swirling between us. Marco sighed heavily. The catering company is handling service. It's not ours. But I know the manager, Giuseppe Torino. We worked together years ago. Hope flickered in my chest. Would he add me to the crew? Marco's eyes narrowed. Perhaps. He owes me favors. Please, Marco, I need this. If I can't sit as her father, then I'll stand as a waiter. Either way, I'll be there. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. At last, he wiped his hands on his apron and nodded slowly. I will call him this morning. But understand, once you begin this path, there is no retreat. You will be invisible, yes, but you will also be putting yourself in the middle of Ethan's world. And men like him don't give up easily. Relief rushed through me like a tide. I gripped his arm. Thank you, Marco. I won't forget this. You are a good man, David Harris, he said firmly. If your son-in-law cannot see it, that is his blindness, not your fault. I finished my coffee, the taste grounding me in the reality of what tomorrow would bring. Black trousers, white shirt, black vest. The same uniform that had kept me in the shadows all these years would now be the key to reclaiming my place at Emma's side. What time should I be there? I asked. Setup starts at 11, Marco replied. Giuseppe will expect you then. He turned back to his work, though his movements were slower, thoughtful. After a moment, he glanced at me again. But listen to me carefully, David. Do not mistake silence for safety. Ethan has power, and he has pride. When you walk into that wedding tomorrow, you will be challenging both. I know, I said, but my dignity isn't what's at stake. My daughter is. Marco nodded, his expression grave, the weight of his decision heavy in the air. Tomorrow, you'll work the wedding, he said finally. but be ready. Men like Ethan don't give up easily. Sunday morning broke with a sharp brightness, the kind of light that revealed every crack and flaw in the world it touched. By the time I arrived at the estate, the grounds were already alive with motion. White tents stretched like sails across the lawn. Florists hurried back and forth carrying arrangements taller than most children, and workers in black uniforms placed row upon row of gleaming chairs in perfect symmetry. I stepped through the side gate, adjusting the black vest over my pressed shirt. To any passerby, I was nothing more than another server, one of many preparing for the most important day of someone else's life. That invisibility, once a burden, now gave me purpose. Giuseppe, the catering manager Marco had spoken to, greeted me with a brisk nod. His thick accent curled around every word, his instructions efficient and sharp. "You, take linens to the east tables. Work fast, we're behind already." He handed me a stack of folded cloth, and I set off without hesitation. Years of service had trained me well. I moved through the garden with practiced efficiency, unfolding white fabric across tables, adjusting the corners until they fell evenly, placing silverware in neat rows. My hands did what they had done 1,000 times before, but my heart raced with the knowledge that this time I wasn't serving strangers. I was laying the stage for my daughter's wedding. The sliding glass doors opened behind me, and I froze. Emma stepped out, her hair tied back in a loose bun, her dress not yet on, but her eyes already alight with both joy and worry. When she saw me, her face broke into a smile that nearly undid me. She hurried across the lawn, stopping just short of throwing her arms around me. "Dad," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "What are you doing here?" "I'm working," I said softly, spreading another linen across the table. Her smile faltered into something more fragile. "You're not supposed to," Ethan said. "I know what he said," I interrupted gently. "But Marco helped me. I'm on the staff for today. Don't worry, I won't make a scene. I'll just be here quiet, doing my job. But I'll see you, Emma. I'll see you walk down the aisle." Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "You shouldn't have to hide." "Maybe not," I said, forcing a small smile. "But sometimes we take what we can. Today, this is enough for me." Before she could respond, the glass door slid open again, and Ethan stepped out. He carried himself with the easy arrogance of a man convinced of his control. But when his gaze landed on me, his face hardened instantly. "What is this?" he demanded, striding forward. "What are you doing here?" Emma moved quickly between us. "Ethan, stop. He's just helping." "Helping?" Ethan's voice rose, sharp enough to cut the air. He turned to me, his expression twisted with fury. "You couldn't follow a simple instruction, could you? You had to find a way to manipulate the situation. This is pathetic." "I'm here to work," I said calmly, straightening the tablecloth I had just placed. "Nothing more." "You think this is clever?" His voice cracked with disbelief. "You're trying to humiliate me. First you beg, then you sneak in as staff. Do you want pity from my guests? Do you want them to see me as cruel while you play the victim?" Emma's voice broke, her hands trembling as she held them up. "Please, both of you. Not today. This is supposed to be our wedding, Ethan." His glare didn't leave me. "If you think I'll let you ruin this day, you're mistaken." He grabbed Emma's arm and pulled her gently but firmly back toward the house. "We'll talk inside." She glanced back at me once, her eyes filled with helpless sorrow, before the door closed behind them. I stood alone among the tables, the cloth fluttering slightly in the morning breeze. My chest tightened. but I forced myself back to work. If I gave in to anger now, Ethan would have won. I folded napkins, placed cutlery, adjusted centerpieces. Each movement steadied me, each action reminding me why I was there. For Emma. Hours later, after the setup was nearly complete, Marco found me near the service tent. His expression was darker than I'd ever seen it, his jaw set in hard lines. He motioned me to follow him into the quiet of the kitchen where the hum of refrigerators masked our voices. He came to me. Marco said without preamble. I already knew who he meant. Ethan? Yes. Marco's voice was thick with restrained anger. He walked in here like he owned the place, pulled out a wad of cash, $5,000 just like that, and told me to make sure you didn't work tomorrow. I felt my stomach drop. What did you say? I told him no, Marco said simply, that some things are not for sale. Relief washed through me, but it lasted only a moment before Marco's next words hit. He didn't stop. He doubled it. 10,000, David. 10,000 cash. Enough to cover 2 months of wages for my entire staff. He thought I'd cave. My throat went dry. And I told him the same thing. Principles matter more than money. My friend, do you know what he did then? I shook my head. He smiled. Marco said grimly. But it wasn't a kind smile. He leaned in close and started listing names. Inspectors, city officials, people who could make my life miserable. He hinted about health inspections, liquor licenses, tax reviews. He wasn't offering anymore. He was threatening. The kitchen felt suddenly smaller, the walls pressing in. I knew Ethan had influence, but hearing it spoken aloud made my chest tighten with dread. He wasn't just determined to erase me. He was willing to burn down anything in his path to do it. I'm sorry, Marco, I whispered. I didn't want you dragged into this. Don't apologize, Marco snapped, his eyes flashing. You think I've survived in this business for 20 years by bowing to bullies? Number. He misjudged me. He thought I'd sell you out, or scare easy when he waved his contacts in my face. But I won't. I told him he could keep his money and his threats. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke, but his voice carried steel. He left angry. He'll make calls tonight. He'll try to pull strings, twist arms, do whatever it takes. This isn't over, David. I exhaled slowly, the weight of what was coming settling deep in my bones. Tomorrow, I would walk into Ethan's world dressed in the uniform he despised, carrying trays for the men and women he worshipped. But I would not be alone. Marco had stood beside me, even when it cost him. He placed a heavy hand on my shoulder, his grip firm. Tomorrow won't go as either of us expects, he warned. Ethan's making calls tonight. By the time I arrived at the estate on Sunday afternoon, the place had been transformed into something out of a magazine spread. White roses cascaded from tall centerpieces, petals soft as silk against the shimmer of crystal vases. Chandeliers, hauled in just for the event, hung beneath the massive tent erected over the lawn, scattering prisms of light across satin tablecloths. Musicians tuned violins and cellos in the corner, their instruments polished to perfection. While waiters in black uniforms moved with quiet efficiency, placing glasses, refilling water, arranging plates with mechanical precision. To the outside eye, I was no different from any of them. My black trousers, crisp white shirt, and fitted vest marked me as invisible. One of many, another shadow passing through the grandeur. Yet beneath that disguise beat the heart of a father determined to witness the most important day of his daughter's life. I slipped easily into the rhythm of service. My hands, long trained in the quiet grace of hospitality, moved as though on instinct. Silver trays rested easily against my palm, glasses balanced without thought, footsteps measured to avoid collisions. The beauty of invisibility was that no one looked closely at the man offering champagne. Their eyes skimmed over me in favor of the more important conversations at their tables, conversations about mergers, real estate ventures, political appointments, and charitable donations that were more about influence than generosity. I poured wine for a venture capitalist who bragged about his latest investment in a biotech firm, served appetizers to a senator whose whispers with a lobbyist carried the weight of unseen deals. I carried on as though deaf, though every word imprinted itself on my mind. I was part of the furniture, essential but unnoticed, and I intended to use that to my advantage. From across the room, I caught sight of Emma. She stood radiant in her gown, her veil trailing like a river of light behind her, her cheeks flushed with excitement and nerves. For a moment, our eyes met. She smiled, small and secret, the kind of smile only a daughter shares with her father. It was enough. I dipped my head slightly, acknowledging her joy, then turned back to my tray before Ethan could notice. The groom was in his element, greeting guests with handshakes that lingered just long enough to imply connection, laughing too loudly at jokes delivered by men with fortunes in the millions. He moved like a man on stage, every gesture performed for an audience he intended to impress. But I saw the tension in his shoulders when his gaze found me drifting between tables, topping off glasses with a calm efficiency. He didn't approach. Not yet. He was saving his performance for later, when he could wield his words with maximum impact. The ceremony itself passed quickly, vows exchanged under a floral arch while the crowd dabbed eyes with linen napkins. I stood near the back, refilling pitchers and offering champagne to those who shifted in their seats. Emma's voice trembled only slightly as she promised forever, her eyes glistening with sincerity. Ethan's vows were smooth, rehearsed, spoken with the confidence of a man who expected applause. When the officiant announced them husband and wife, the crowd erupted in claps and cheers, and I swallowed the knot in my throat. She looked breathtaking, and I had seen it. That was enough for now. The reception began in full force. Plates of salmon and roasted vegetables were carried to tables, glasses clinked, laughter spilled into the night. I moved silently through it all, invisible yet always watching. A few guests thanked me absently, their attention never leaving their conversations. One elderly man in a tuxedo paused to look me over, his gaze thoughtful. "Good service," he said with a nod before turning back to his companions. I inclined my head politely and carried on. That was my role. Then came the moment I had been expecting. Ethan rose from the head table, his glass in hand, tapping a silver spoon against it until the chatter quieted. The music faded, and the room turned toward him with eager attention. He smiled, that calculated smile he wore so well, the one meant to charm cameras and investors alike. Emma sat beside him, her hands clasped in her lap, her posture perfect though her eyes betrayed nervousness. She already knew where this was headed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice carrying smoothly across the room, "I want to thank you all for being here tonight. We are surrounded by extraordinary people, leaders, visionaries, those who shape industries and guide our society toward greatness." Applause rippled politely, and he raised his glass higher. This marriage is more than a union of two people. It is a merging of paths, a celebration of excellence, a demonstration of what happens when ambition meets opportunity. His words flowed like a polished speech, the kind delivered at fundraising dinners or corporate galas. The crowd nodded along, charmed by the cadence, even if they weren't listening to the meaning. Then, with a subtle shift, his eyes locked on me across the room. His tone cooled. "Of course, not everyone reaches the same heights," he said, his voice gaining an edge. "Not everyone contributes equally. There are leaders, and there are followers, builders and those who serve. We all have our places in life." I felt the weight of dozens of eyes turning toward me even before he gestured. His glass tilted in my direction, the smile on his lips twisting into something cruel. "Take that man, for example," Ethan continued. "My father-in-law. He's only a waiter." The words landed like stones dropped in still water. A hush spread through the crowd, the air thick with discomfort. Emma's face drained of color, her mouth parting in shock. A few guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between Ethan and me, uncertain whether to laugh or protest. But no one spoke. I stood steady, tray balanced in my hand, heart pounding but my expression calm. I had known this was coming. I had prepared myself for it. He has spent his life carrying trays, serving drinks, clearing plates, Ethan said, his voice rising with a kind of intoxication. And while there is dignity in all work, we must be honest. Some men build futures. Others simply watch from the sidelines. The silence in the room grew heavier. Some guests avoided looking at me entirely, embarrassed by his cruelty, while others watched intently, waiting for my reaction. I did not give Ethan the satisfaction of anger. I did not let him see pain. I adjusted the tray in my hand, my movements precise, my back straight, my chin level. I was not here to trade insults. I was here to serve, to endure, to be present for Emma in the only way left to me. Emma's voice finally broke through, trembling with anger. "Ethan, stop." But he didn't. He was too far gone, drunk on his own display of power. "Some people dream of greatness," he said, his voice booming across the hall. "Others pour the wine while greatness happens around them. That is the truth of life." The room seemed to hold its breath. I took one slow step forward, moving with deliberate calm toward a nearby table. I set the tray down, picked up a bottle of champagne, and began pouring into empty glasses. My hands were steady, my movements graceful, as though nothing had been said at all. "Would anyone like more champagne?" I asked, steady as stone. For a long, breathless moment, the silence in the room was almost unbearable. The air seemed heavy, pressing against my chest, as though the chandelier lights themselves had dimmed under the weight of Ethan's cruelty. Guests exchanged uneasy glances, some staring down at their plates to avoid the spectacle, others sneaking looks at me to see how I would react. But I gave them nothing. No anger, no shame, only the calm rhythm of a man carrying out his duties. I poured champagne, adjusted glasses, and moved from table to table with quiet precision. It was my shield and my defiance rolled into one. Ethan remained standing at the head table, his hand still clutching the stem of his glass. He had expected a reaction, rage, protest, a scene that would validate his dismissal of me. Instead, my composure stripped him of satisfaction, leaving him stranded in a silence that grew more uncomfortable with each passing second. Guests began to murmur softly among themselves, trying to steer conversation back to safer ground. But the tension lingered. I turned away, setting down my tray at the service station near the bar. That was when it happened. A young man in his 20s, seated with a group of friends near the television mounted on the wall above the bar, suddenly froze mid-scroll on his phone. His eyes darted between the screen and me. Then he leaned forward, his voice cutting through the low hum of the room. "Wait a second," he said, louder than he intended. "That's him. That's the same guy." Heads turned. Confusion rippled through the crowd as people looked toward the television. The venue kept it running quietly, showing a late-night rerun of an old film. The sound muted, but the images sharp. On the screen, a young naval officer in uniform stood at attention, speaking lines with conviction and pride. The camera captured his face in close-up, earnest, striking, unmistakable. The face was mine, 30 years younger, but mine all the same. At first, there was disbelief. Guests blinked, squinting at the screen, then at me, then back again. The resemblance was undeniable, and recognition spread like a spark through dry grass. "That's him," the young man repeated, excitement bubbling in his voice. "The waiter. It's the same man from the movie." Gasps echoed through the room. An older woman in a sequined dress leaned forward, her voice trembling with wonder. "I remember this film. He was marvelous in it." She turned her eyes on me, filled with recognition. "It's him. It's really him." Suddenly, the quiet murmur of conversation became a roar of voices. Phones emerged from pockets and purses, screens lighting up as guests hurried to search my name. The glow of dozens of devices filled the room as fingers tapped frantically, pages loading, images appearing. I stood rooted to the spot, my tray forgotten, as the revelation spread from table to table. Whispers turned into exclamations, doubt turned into certainty. "David Harris." One guest read aloud from her phone, her voice carrying through the sudden hush. 7 major films between 1987 and 1995. Golden Globe nomination for Atlantic Crossing. The air buzzed with astonishment. More people confirmed it, showing each other photos of my younger self, clips from old interviews, reviews praising my performances. Faces turned toward me, eyes wide with shock and newfound respect. The man they had thought of as invisible, a shadow in a waiter's uniform, was revealed to be someone they had once admired on the silver screen. At the head table, Ethan's face had gone pale. His fingers loosened around the stem of his glass, and for a moment I thought he might drop it just as he had the night before. His eyes darted between me and the television, disbelief and horror battling in his expression. His carefully constructed image, the dominance he had asserted with his cruel toast, was unraveling before the very people he had been so desperate to impress. I glanced across the room at Emma. She sat frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes wide with shock. Slowly, her gaze shifted from the television to me, and I saw dawning understanding flood her face. She realized, in that instant, what I had given up, the life I had left behind so she could have a better one. Guests rose from their seats, pointing, whispering, exclaiming. Some approached me cautiously, their voices reverent. "Why didn't you say anything?" a man asked, his phone still clutched in his hand. Clips from one of my films played silently on his screen, my younger face speaking lines with passion and intensity. I met his gaze with steady calm. "Tonight isn't about me," I said quietly. "It's about Emma." The words only seemed to deepen their fascination. Here was a man who had once lived in the spotlight, who had chosen silence and service over fame, who now stood in a waiter's vest with dignity unshaken. Guests nodded, murmuring words of respect, some even applauding softly, though the applause was hesitant at first, as though they weren't sure if they should. Emma's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. She moved toward me slowly, weaving between tables, her gown brushing against chairs as she passed. The room seemed to part for her, the crowd stepping aside to create a path. Her eyes never left mine. tears shimmering as she closed the distance. When she reached me, her hands trembled as she took mine in hers. The touch was both fragile and fierce, filled with questions unspoken. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke, barely above a whisper, but the silence in the room carried it clearly. "Why didn't you ever tell me, Dad?" she whispered, tears in her eyes. For a moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, my chest heavy with the weight of decades. Around us, the wedding guests waited in stunned silence. Phones still glowing in their hands, the television screen still frozen on the image of my younger self. Emma's question cut deeper than Ethan's insults ever had, because it carried the ache of love and confusion, not cruelty. I lifted my hands and gently cupped hers, meeting her gaze. "Because it didn't matter," I said softly. "What mattered was you. When you were born, I had a choice. I could chase fame, or I could give you a life I never had. Acting would have taken me away from you. Late nights, endless travel, roles that might vanish as quickly as they appeared. I chose family. I chose you. Every plate I carried, every late shift, every aching step, it was worth it, because it gave you a future." Her tears spilled freely, streaking down her cheeks, but her eyes never left mine. The silence in the room broke with a rustle of movement. Guests rose slowly to their feet, their faces transformed from shock to admiration. An elderly gentleman near the back clapped first, his hand steady and deliberate. Others followed, hesitant at first, then stronger, until the room filled with the sound of applause. It wasn't the polite applause of a business function. It was full, heartfelt, a standing ovation for something real. I stood there in my waiter's vest, holding my daughter's hands, as the crowd honored not a movie star, but a father who had chosen love over ambition. My knees felt weak, my heart racing, but I kept my head high. Emma leaned into me, pressing her forehead against mine. "You gave up everything," she whispered. "No," I said, my voice steady. "I gained everything. A daughter who grew into a remarkable woman, a life filled with meaning. No role could ever compare to that." The applause swelled, echoing beneath the chandeliers, carrying with it a warmth I had not felt in years. Guests who had once avoided looking at me now smiled, nodding with respect. The servers in the back even paused, their faces lit with quiet pride. For once, I was not invisible. At the head table, Ethan remained seated. His face was pale, his eyes darting nervously across the room, as though searching for an escape. He had built this day as a display of wealth, a showcase of influence, a performance of control. In one revelation, that control had crumbled. The man he had mocked as only a waiter had just been revealed as someone admired, someone applauded, someone who had once stood in the very spotlight Ethan craved. Worse still, the grace with which I carried myself had made his cruelty look small, petty, and shameful. Finally, Ethan stood, though his posture was different now. The arrogance had drained away, replaced by a hesitance I had never seen in him before. He cleared his throat, his voice catching as he addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his tone softer, less certain. "Earlier tonight, I said things I regret. I was wrong, completely wrong." The room hushed instantly, the applause fading into silence. Every eye turned to him. He swallowed hard, his mask of confidence faltering. "David Harris is not just a waiter. He is a father who gave up fame to raise his daughter with love and sacrifice. I judged him by money, by status, by the shallow things I thought mattered. But tonight, I saw what truly matters: character, family, love. He is more of a man than I have ever been, and I am sorry. He turned toward me, his voice breaking. "David, if you'll allow me, I would like to start over. Not as the man who tried to erase you, but as your son-in-law, as Emma's husband." As family gasps ran through the room. Some nodded, some whispered, some crossed their arms skeptically. All waited for my response. I stepped forward slowly, my hands steady at my sides. Ethan's eyes met mine, and for the first time, I saw not arrogance, but vulnerability. I extended my hand. "Family is what matters most," I said clearly. "Everything else is just noise." He clasped my hand in both of his grip trembling, his eyes shining with the shame of a man who had finally seen his own reflection. "I was afraid," he whispered, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Afraid you would make me look small. But I did that to myself." "You did," I agreed, my voice calm. "But we can move forward." Emma joined us, wrapping her arms around both of us, pulling us into a circle that dissolved the barrier between us. "I love you both," she said through tears. The guests erupted again in applause, louder, warmer. This time not just for me, but for the reconciliation unfolding before their eyes. Dinner continued, but the energy had shifted entirely. Guests who had whispered politics and profits now spoke of family and sacrifice. Some approached me with handshakes and kind words, others with questions about my films, their curiosity tinged with respect rather than arrogance. But through it all, I kept my focus on Emma. She glowed, her smile radiant, her joy restored. When the music began, she turned to me, her eyes sparkling through tears. "Dad," she said softly, "would you dance with me?" "Always," I replied. We moved onto the dance floor, the crowd parting to form a circle around us. The band played a slow melody, the notes swelling as Emma placed her hand in mine. For a moment, it felt like the world had fallen away. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I held her close, every step a memory of the years that had led us here. Her first steps as a child, her first recital, her graduation, all of it echoed in the rhythm of our dance. As we turned slowly beneath the chandeliers, I caught sight of Ethan. He stood at the edge of the floor, watching with something that looked like gratitude rather than resentment. Marco lingered near the kitchen, his face alight with quiet satisfaction. Even Giuseppe, who had known me only as another pair of hands, watched with approval. The guests clapped along softly as we finished the dance, and I realized the true irony of the night. Ethan had wanted this wedding to be remembered for wealth and power, but it would be remembered for something else entirely. For a father who chose family over fame. For a daughter who saw her father's love in its truest form. For the redemption of a man who had once tried to erase me, but was forced to acknowledge my worth. The night carried on with laughter and dancing, the tension of earlier hours replaced with warmth. I slipped to the side eventually, pouring myself a cup of coffee from the service station. The aroma rose, rich and grounding, and I took a deep breath. The uniform still hung on my shoulders, but it no longer felt like armor or disguise. It felt like truth. I was both things, a waiter and a father, a man who had once stood in front of cameras and a man who now stood proudly beside his daughter. None of it diminished me. It all defined me. When Emma returned to my side, her face glowing with happiness, I realized my greatest performance had never been on a stage or a screen. It had been in the quiet hours of sacrifice, the long nights of work, the endless devotion of a father's love. Fame had been fleeting. Family was forever. As the evening drew to a close and guests prepared to leave, Emma squeezed my hand. I'm proud to be your daughter, she said simply. Those words meant more than any standing ovation, any award, any recognition I had ever received. I smiled, the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. And I'm proud to be your father. The chandeliers glimmered overhead, the music faded into the night, and I knew that this was the ending I had been waiting for all along. Not applause, not recognition, but love. Pure, undeniable, lasting love. If you liked this story, subscribe and tell us your thoughts in the comments. To hear the next one, click on the box on the screen.